When it comes to self-development, no matter the method you use, the vital point is to practice. If you're ready to learn practices to transform your life and claim the potential inside of you, then you're in the right place. Welcome to The Vital Point. I'm your host, Jonathan Schechter. I'm a psychedelic integration coach, breathwork facilitator, and an enthusiast of personal growth. You have the capacity to evolve and bring your intentions and dreams into the world, and there's never been more access to so many incredible modalities that can help you on your journey. This podcast will help you learn simple methods you can use to transform your life and share the stories of practitioners who are doing the work so that you feel inspired to go and practice, because that's the vital point. My guest on today's episode is Dr. Ryan Westrum. He is the founder and visionary of Healing Souls. He's been a mental health practitioner for over 20 years and is the author of this amazing book, the Psychedelic Integration Handbook, and host of the Psychedelic Psychologist podcast. He leveraged his background in traditional therapeutic methods and infused his work with holistic, intuitive therapies that empower you to take charge of your life and mental health. And he's earned his doctorate of psychology from Sophia University in San Francisco, as well as holding an MA degree in marriage and family therapy from the Adler Graduate School and a BA in psychology from the University of Minnesota. His areas of specialty include psychedelic therapy, addiction, trauma, LGBTQIA, sex addiction, sexual trauma, sexual reassignment, anxiety, depression, anger management, teenage relationships, couple and marriage relationships, grief and loss, spirituality, experiential work, and end-of-life transitioning. So, wow, I'm really grateful to have Ryan here on the podcast. Welcome.
Jonathan, it's an honor, and I'm very humbled to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's interesting because I reach out to a lot of people and when Ryan reached out to me, I was like, wow, okay, I literally have this book sitting here on my desk. How super cool is it? And I'm thrilled that we're able to connect here.
Yeah, the beauty of synchronicity,
So,
right?
yeah, amazing. So, how did you get involved in psychedelics? Was that something that kind of just transitioned from your work in the mental health field, or like tell me the story of how that came about for you?
It's the classic story that I'm going to start talking about when I was an infant. The irony is I actually took my first dose when I was 12 years old, and without belaboring my long history, Jonathan, it was a clandestine situation where, by the grace of the higher powers that be and my spiritual allies, protected me, and I had a pretty significant dose of psilocybin at a very young age, which led me on this trajectory and to kind of be all psychedelic starting at the end now is why I wrote the book for my 12-year-old self. So as I was
Wow.
positioning this book, right, it was designed because, I was pre-internet or pre-significant internet, and I needed something to tether to, and I didn't have it. I was grabbing at books that fell off the shelf and all the different things. And telling my personal story, I hope, allows people to feel a deeper connection to listening to their intuition and allowing themselves to find safe space and allies that they can trust as mentors, as healers, as teachers, as providers of guidance. And it was far before anything started coming back into position with psychedelics that I was kind of exploring what was intuitive to me. Moments I would drop it and set it down, moments I would pick it up, but the whole entire time there was a cadence, Jonathan, for me to listen to what was intuitively coming through me and being asked or being offered.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting what you said in terms of like the psychedelic integration handbook that you wrote, like kind of bringing all these other things together, because that was one of my first impressions of the book was like, wow, it's like this is like a compendium of a lot of different methods and sources and a lot of information all compiled down into this one wonderful source. And I found myself feeling really grateful to have this, when I first started getting interested in using psychedelics more intentionally. I've, like you, like, have been working with psychedelics, if you want to say working with, from a, fairly young age, but it was mostly recreational. I didn't understand anything about the language of integration or, that container, even though some of my experiences were like subtly pushing me into this like spiritual, like enlightening kind of direction. Having resources like your handbook really helped to start to turn the corner in terms of like what was possible in terms of healing, in terms of growth. And so to have something like this where there's so many different methods that you can immediately put into practice for yourself, I just found really, really amazing.
Well, I'm deeply appreciative. I thank you for saying so kind words. The practicality of it is really what I was aiming for, and I hear that endorsed by what you're saying is there's a need for when we're working with psychedelics to ground them, make sense of them because we are embodied right now, right? I know
Mhm.
psychedelics lead us to want to understand the ethos or the cosmos or the proverbial why we're here, and yet what I'm hearing constantly throughout my practice and would love to hear more from you is people want to know then now what to do with it, like
Mm.
how do
Mhm.
we, and that's what integration is to me, is taking one thing and taking another and integrating them together, pretty much one plus one equals two, and how we can not oversimplify it, but for lack of better terms, learn to actively participate with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things for me that like wanted to lead me into the work that I'm doing was my experiences of like having these really embodied, unified, unity consciousness, higher sort of realms of existence and consciousness, having a taste of that and feeling like, yes, this is it. Like I've arrived. And then the frustration of that experience fading and kind of coming back into the human experience and being like, no, I want that, wait, this is what I wanted, like where did that go? And then I started to notice, sitting in integration circles and talking to other people, hearing similar stories from them of like, well, I'm back here for another ceremony because I'm still looking for that thing, or on the flip side of it, like them coming out of, like a weekend of ayahuasca and being like, oh, love and light, everything's amazing and perfect. And then what, coming back to them a few weeks later and it's like, well, all my shit's back, like
Right.
but the behavior hasn't changed, or that can be so frustrating. I remember it feeling frustrating to me of like, wait, like now I had this experience, it's not a theory, I know it's there, so how do I merge that with the rest of my life? How do I integrate it? And to borrow that like kind of Buddhist, phrase, it's like, after the enlightenment, chop wood and carry water, so how do we do that? And how do we bring those bits and those experiences of these other realms and of these other consciousnesses into the rest of our lives?
It's a great question. And the answer that always comes to mind with me is being curious, but being compassionate in our curiosity, right? So I often end a lot of my emails or conversations or even my own stories with people is how are you being gentle with yourself? And I think if we can start with that, Jonathan, allowing ourselves to have compassionate grace and gentleness to what we're dealing with, I mean, let's put it in perspective. We're working with many plants that have existed far beyond verbal and written history. So
Yeah.
it's somewhat arrogant yet a little bit narcissistic to think we as human beings are gonna, understand what is being downloaded on us. And I say it humbly because myself included, I know nothing. I'm seeking curiosity for reassurance. I'm seeking an understanding, sir, to be compassionate to what we're attempting to make sense of. And if we can lead with gentleness, then there might be some space to go, oh yeah, now I get it, or now I can at least come into concert with that conversation, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. What you just said, one of the things that it reminds me of is something that has been kicking around in my head recently in terms of sort of the hubris of people that like say we're approaching this work with at least, if it, depending on your perspective, lifetimes of built up karma, habits, behavior, but even just to keep it within this lifetime, right? Like say your
Hmm.
entire life, your childhood experiences, whatever complex trauma, if you're, familiar with like the work of Stan Groff, the things that happen to you in the birth experience that are still kind of stuck in your body, not to mention everything else that's happened to you since, right? And then you're
Right.
going into this ceremony and sort of expecting that one psychedelic experience is going to change all of that. And that's not necessarily realistic. Like we're asking a lot of these amazing plants and molecules. And so I'm like, hey, like, can we slow down a little bit? Can we like have some patience in this process and realize the magnitude of what we're trying to shift? And even shifting a couple of degrees in the direction that you'd like or that feels more aligned to you is a big accomplishment and worth like celebrating, I think.
It's true, and where what immediately comes to mind, Jonathan, when you say that, as just a personal reminder, is I live in Minnesota, so as you talk about just a degree or two, as our access on the planet moves just a degree or two, we could be in 13 below zero today, and tomorrow we might be in 42 above zero. So it's like, that's when I share with people, similar to what you just said, as a ringing endorsement of healing, is look at the gradients of growth rather than these radical transformations of growth. And if you can look at it
Mm,
in that way, this sense of like, oh yeah, what a gradient or a degree of growth is and how substantial that can be for somebody, there I feel like fosters hope or provides them a
yeah,
reassurance that they're at least right on the right trajectory.
absolutely. Yeah, it's so funny you say that. I remember I lived in Minnesota for a time, and I remember like one of the things that struck me, just besides for the temperature difference between where I live now and Arizona, is like during the summer, how late it would stay light out. It would be like 9 or almost 10 o'clock, and the sun would still be out. And then like on the traverse, during the winter, it was almost like where'd that sun go, like um and just like you're saying, just a few degrees of difference creates such a different experience, in that environment. It's
Right,
amazing.
right. Yeah.
The other
Well,
thing that
you were
you
smart.
said that
You got out. You got out.
well, it's funny that people in Minnesota would say the same thing. They're like, why would you go live there? It's so hot,
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
the
It's
people here are
relative.
like, why would you live there? Yeah. Um, the other thing that I love that you just said, that I'd love to just keep like going over a little bit is the curiosity and the curiosity with compassion. And I guess what comes up for me is like, because curiosity has become a really big part of my own personal experience as well, instead of being judgmental. And I realize that when I'm curious about my experience, there's a lack of judgment. And so if I don't have that curiosity, if I'm being judgmental about that experience, oftentimes that's not where I'm being compassionate or kind to myself, because there's a judgment there about how things should be, or, some sort of inner critic part or something like that that's like running the show and trying to dictate my experience, instead of like approaching it, like you said, with that curiosity. And to me, it's curiosity is like one of the most important things that I try to impart to people. So I'm glad that you
Yeah,
said
it's
that.
fantastic you say that because at the end of the day, then we have space to develop, right? There's room to grow.
Yeah. Yeah. It's not bringing in our pre notions of like what's supposed to be. And I've been working recently at a residential treatment center. And so it's really interesting, like working with a different sort of group of folks that I have been working with sort of as a psychedelic integration coach, but I'm doing breath work
Hmm.
with them. And I'm like constantly like saying like, hey, be curious about what's happening. Like, is it okay just to be here right now and be curious about what's coming up rather than kind of shutting down and like being like, no, I can't handle this, and
Yeah.
it's, it's amazing.
Well, and what you're saying, I want to just take a moment to pause too of the prudent approach of the difference between psychedelics and what breathwork can have. And as you eloquently know in your practice, and for people to hear, is today we think because of the wonderful new renaissance of psychedelics, is we should catch up or do more. Well, I'm here to
Mm,
say we should be a little more prudent with our approach, intentional with the reason why we're using it, and then doing activities such as breath work or classical therapy or just setting it down. I mean, I'm in the scheme
yeah.
today, Jonathan, of saying, hey, let's put it on the shelf. It's okay to go back to. It's always going to be there at some level. And be okay with trying to like really dive into and create what is your integration process. What are you
Yeah.
doing outside of those expressions?
Yeah, absolutely. I can totally relate to that. I mean, I've been basically psychedelic sober for going on about a year and a half outside of some microdosing, protocols and, like some random experiences here and there. And a lot of the reason for that was sort of the magnitude of the experiences that I had previously and the frequency in which they were occurring. It almost like I was like, okay, I need to just pause and start to actually work on this mountain of things that I need to integrate now, and like you said, it's always going to be there. Um, yeah, it's an interesting place we're in, right? Like with these medicines coming so close now into the mainstream and becoming so much more prevalent. It's almost like we're bringing that Western medical kind of viewpoint into it of like, take this pill and you'll be cured. And that's not what psychedelics are at all, And so I've literally heard, and I'm sure you do too, right? Probably much more than I do, of like, well, I'm looking for this like magic pill, or I'm looking for this,
Right.
magic
Hmm.
bullet. And I'm like, you're looking in the wrong place. Like,
Without a doubt.
you know,
Without a doubt. And
yeah.
to piggyback off of what you're saying, I think one of the things we should be skeptical about, or at least prudently aware of, is what you're alluding to is using these medicines for not only a one hit pill, but Jonathan, the idea of now I'm noticing every single diagnosis, every single disorder, every single symptom of sorts is being studied, which I deeply appreciate, and I am not the gatekeeper. But where I become skeptical is how, like you said a couple minutes ago, does this not seem to be mirroring what the medical model is? Is hey, you have this, use psychedelics. You have this, use psychedelics. You have this, use psychedelics, and that to me feels a little incongruent of what would be beneficial to somebody. And I don't believe it's for everybody.
Right. Yeah, to me, and I don't think I'm alone with this. Psychedelics are sort of the starting point. They take you
Hmm.
right to the work. They don't do the work for you. They just kind of shine a light on what's there to do. And from that perspective, they can be very healing and very helpful for things like addiction or depression, anxiety, because like at least within the Western medical model, especially like for addiction, like I don't think that addiction is necessarily the problem. It's what the addiction is trying to cover up and cope is the underlying problem. So if we can do that work, if you have a psychedelic experience and then points at some of those underlying issues, trauma, complex childhood experiences, other adverse experiences that, you've been using some sort of substance or some sort of activity to cope and soothe your nervous system so that you don't have to work with that, well, there is an opportunity there, but you're still going to have to do some work, you know? My experience was exactly that. Like, I came out of a abusive marriage where I was drinking a lot, using cannabis every day, and not in a therapeutic manner or intentional manner. Um, I was probably about 50 pounds heavier than I am now, because of my diet. And my immediate reaction was like, okay, I'm going to start exploring more with plant medicines, and I'm going to clean up my life. I'm going to stop drinking. I'm going to start eating better. And as soon as I did that, all the things that those behaviors were like covering up started to
Hmm.
bubble up to the surface, and I had to deal with them. And in the beginning, it was fucking hard, like it was like,
Right.
wow, no wonder I was drinking. No wonder I was eating like this, because there was some stuff there that I wasn't ready to deal with. So it definitely, these medicines are super, super transformative. And yet I think we have to approach them in a very grounded and realistic manner.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, bringing in a kind of prudent expectation of what, like you said, we're trying to do with them, because the legwork does come along with it. And as you eloquently said, it shines a light on something now we have to look at.
Yeah, one of the things that kind of struck me, as I was reviewing the Psychedelic Integration Handbook, in preparation for our interview today, was, um, a lot of the integration exercises and things, the practices that are offered within it, they're wonderful for integration of a psychedelic experience. Many of them are just wonderful in terms of self-care, period. You could take the psychedelic part out of it, and it would still be things that are good for you to do for your health, for your self-care, for self-discovery and exploration of, and so it's not, just to further to your point, it's bigger than just the psychedelic. It's, you're
Truly,
speaking to a much more holistic approach, and I
truly.
think that that's
And
something we have in common.
I appreciate that, and I'm sorry for stepping on your toes. I get
No, no,
excited
sorry.
about that topic. And the idea is, Jonathan, exactly, it's taking elementary ideas and solving for complex problems. So you are intuitively and accurate with what you witnessed in that book. Is my ideas are not anything revolutionary. I'll be the first one to say that they're common things that we should be doing to take care of them. What I do in that book, just to articulate a little further and distill it, is at some points I do talk about the relevance of why these exercises are important within the realm of psychedelics, and then why they're also important to just live. Make it your own in your
Right.
everyday. Building an altar, or, taking a moment to take contemplation and stillness, or eat silently. There's relevance to the psychedelic aspect, but really beyond that, it's this human experience that we're attempting to really be comfortable in. And I don't mean to sound existential, but it's coming across that way. So I don't know how many people at large are really comfortable with this embodied experience.
Hmm.
And so to be like, okay, let's use some integration activities to go, yeah, I am comfortable in this body, and it's fun to express it in those ways, those actions.
Yeah. Getting comfortable with silence, bringing the sacred in to your life and connecting with it in an embodied way. I definitely agree. That's great for everyone, regardless of whether you're working with psychedelics. And um, yeah, I agree with what you're saying. Especially it seems like the way that we're going in our society, where we're so plugged in and constantly looking at a screen, constantly kind of, attention has become the sort of the currency right now of,
Sure.
what companies are vying for. And a lot of the practices, that we're talking about in terms of like walking meditation, building an altar, just doing some sitting meditation, eating silently. Um, those are quite the antithesis of sort of the way that we're being encouraged to spend our time.
Right.
I know for myself, like that's been a huge turning point in my own life, is like unplugging, intentionally, and creating, a daily practice where I am, spending it intentionally, connecting with my body, connecting with spirit, um, and doing that before I start to plug in and get on the hamster wheel, that I that I think we're all forced to be on a little bit, if we want to be in sort of the normal, quote unquote, normal society.
Well, when you say that, it reminds me of what you talked about being chop wood, carry water. I'm actually a firm believer of digital detoxing. So part of my practices, as well as I hold up my dumb phone, is not texting, engaging in healthy conversations. And, I'm a guinea pig, so I'm not sounding like an elitist or, a directive of what it's taken me 5 years, almost 4 years now, not to have a smartphone, to practice it. And it came through the psychedelic medicines of recognizing what you're saying. And from my translation, sir, I believe our culture is firmly engaged in consumption rather than digestion. And what happens, and what's building anxiety, to talk a little bit psychologically, is that I'm seeing our culture and our societies percolating with this insane amount of anxiety, because we're roughly supposed to be digesting anywhere from, what's on average, 275 full-length newspapers a day. And not to
Mm.
digress from our conversation about integration, but in that, it makes people think then we are seeking more than we need to. And that's where it kind of
Mm.
dovetails back, Jonathan, to psychedelics. Is I want to offer the consolation that we don't have to do it a lot. We don't have to try to consume more. We have to learn to digest what we have and ask ourselves, is this enough? Finding contentment in ourselves and saying, okay, yeah, I'm good enough. I don't need to know what's going on across the country, let alone across the planet, besides being informed, right? I'm not trying to, shut people out or say we're not globally worthy of knowing about each other, but
Yeah.
rather prudently understanding and compassionately curious, without being consumed by thinking we have to be everywhere at one time, because we're not light beings. We can't be everywhere at one time.
Well, I mean, first of all, I gotta tip my hat to you just to be able to not have a smartphone and to be able to detox that much. I know that how large of an undertaking that can be. It certainly is a challenge for myself to even turn things off for a couple of hours a day, let alone turn my phone completely off. So I just want to commend you for that. I think it's admirable, and it's an amazing feat. Um, what's interesting? What came up while you were saying that, and I totally agree. Like, in terms of the amount of information that we're presented with on a daily basis, and the things that we're just, I think I read somewhere recently, I'm gonna mess up the statistic, but it was something like, we get more information presented to us in a day than somebody like 100 years would have seen in their entire life, you know um,
Yep.
and the ramifications of that, that we don't even know, right? Because the technology is moving so quickly. um, but what came up for me as you were saying that was this thought that, in a way, um, a good psychedelic journey can sort of expose us to a similar
Mm,
channel of
right.
information. All of a sudden, like, we're accessing a lot higher bandwidth of frequency. We have access to different planes of information, or frequencies that are coming through. And I know for me, like, one of the things that has changed in my work is, like, rather than let me just open that channel as much as possible and just kind of, you know, drink from the fire hose, so to speak. It's, what kinds of breathing practices and embodiment practices can I bring into the experience, so that I can be as present as possible to the experience itself. Um, and I, I don't know, I'm not an expert, but for me at least, that's been very transformative in terms of like the work that I'm able to do within my journeys, as opposed to just having this wild ride of a trip that kind of goes in whatever direction it may, and I'm just kind of trying to hold on to the tiger's tail.
Yeah, right. I really I'm grateful for you bringing these two together and allowing me to talk about that, because that's exactly my internal desire and support for people, is to minimize our expectations. As you just said very eloquently, is not only is our brain being open to an opportunity to digest more and consume more, what comes with that, though, is then an overarching concern is like, okay, I came in with these intentions, 3 or 4 intentions, and now I'm supposed to also walk away with them. And my request and my public service announcement, based off of what we're talking about here, is, hey, allow yourself to know that maybe you just got downloaded with infinite wisdom of the source, or you met, God, or you created an understanding of what your next 20 years on this life looks like. That doesn't mean you have to do something with it today, or, like, slow the roll. Like, let's make this incremental. Let's take on what feels heart-centered, front of mind, do something with it. And I'm not suggesting like this, siloed everything. I'm going to just eat one thing and do one thing. That's absurd. What I'm saying is monitor and moderate the level of how you integrate too. Don't think we can do all 10 things that were just given to us in the psychedelic field. Like,
Mm.
just because people are saying, yeah, your brain is becoming neuroplastic and we're like biohacking the shit out of our life, does not come with like infinite wisdom of how to fucking do anything with it. And I'm sorry for being so crass, but it's designed to like let the levity of like, hey, this is serious work, but if we're going to take it with that much intensity, we're going to be put in check all the time. And we're going to walk away from those experiences defeated, or as you said earlier, needing or having a desire to then recreate that and chasing, you know, the tail of the dragon and just going, okay, I'm limited again. I met my limitations. Whereas I want to reflect and reframe that and say, well, did you do your best efforts within what you got? Are you capable of putting some things on the shelf to revisit? As you said beautifully, year and a half of psychedelic sobriety, you're still churning and cultivating shit, I'm sure. I know I do.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And that's the
Yeah.
endorsement, without sounding like I'm on this crazy ass soapbox, for people. Just be prudently confident in what you know. And, if you can't carry it or make sense of it, that's okay. Totally okay.
Yeah. I think
I get
it comes
kind of
back to
intense about that.
no, I think it comes back to what you said in the beginning in terms of, having care for yourself with the curiosity as well. It's like, hey, it's okay that I don't figure this all out in this moment. It's
Right.
totally okay. And
Yeah.
like you're saying, probably if I take a step back and can look at it a little bit more objectively, probably to be expected based on, the full scope of the experience.
Yeah, and again, without circling back, it's that beautiful word you used, is not being so hubris that we're gonna just download the infinite wisdom of psilocybin mushrooms that have enough. It's like even me saying that out loud makes me laugh.
Right, right. Yeah, no, it's kind of like a rabbit hole you could go down forever, at least from the human perspective.
Right.
Um, it's fun. I mean, there's definitely times where I enjoy kind of like, you know, sticking one foot in that hole and being like, oh, okay, so let's talk about stoned ape theory, or like let's talk about the
Right.
mushrooms being this alien intelligence, things like that. Like, okay, those are really cool ideas, but it's almost like what it reminds me of is like in Buddhism, like there were questions that people came and asked the Buddha, cosmic type questions,
Hmm.
where he would say like that the answer to that question doesn't really matter, and it doesn't interest me. Like I'm here
Well,
to teach you about suffering and how to like get past it. And
right.
these cosmic questions don't really matter in that context. So
Right.
it's like, will we really know if stoned ape theory is true or not? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So is it the most important question to answer right now? Maybe not.
Right. And what I love about what you're saying, and again, take it with a grain of salt, is this idea of theoretically taking something and then practically acting within it. So a large aspect of how I want to remind myself and how I believe is this idea is, okay, I have this theoretical idea, say the stoned ape theory, and then what can I do to practically like live in that, to wonder and be okay in it, in my body, in my emotional heart, in my thoughts. And then on the other end of that experience, be it with psychedelics, breath work, hypnosis, or any other non ordinary states, dreams, go, okay, yeah, now let me walk with it for the remaining time that I have on this earth. And then when it dissipates, like everything does, reconstitute something else of curiosity.
Hmm. Yeah. You mentioned hypnosis there, and that was something that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about as well. So hypnotherapy is something that you work with in your practice. Is that right?
That's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm becoming more curious about this just for my own practice and based on some things I've been studying recently. What are some of the ways that hypnotherapy could assist in that integration process or just in our lives in general? How does
It's
that
a great
work?
question. And so the first thing I always like to share is a disclaimer that hypnotherapy is designed, especially in the therapeutic realm, is really suggestion and guidance and support of opening the unconscious or the subconscious, or what I like to coin as the superconscious, right? And it's not me training people to quack like a chicken or, satiate something that they think. It's really offering somebody, and I appreciate the laughter when I hear that from people, is they're like, okay, so once we have to kind of demystify that, how I use and personally use hypnosis is an integrative tool between sessions or prior to, depending on potential people's fears, right? And again,
Mm,
this is as somebody's talking about the magnitude of their psychedelic experiences, a large aspect of their story becomes almost petrified in fear of uncertainty or concern of not making sense of it, right? So, on either end of the experience, a person's either talking about the fear and anxiety of what's coming up, or at the end of it, I don't know if I'm going to be able to hold this and harness it, as we spoke about really clearly. And so, when I use hypnosis and how I invite hypnosis is helping people kind of just ground it in their body and really cultivate a continuation of their superconscious, right? A continuation of, as you earlier mentioned, Stan Grof's work, who I deeply admire and deeply revere, is that inner healer, allowing the inner healer to continue to walk with you. And he coined that term to say that we know what we have within us, we just have to get out of the way.
right.
Right. So this hypnosis
Absolutely.
is a practice of like continuously um, polishing what is, or maybe, dare I say, inviting something in a little easier accessible. Right. The love affair I have with hypnosis, and I'm sure you can appreciate with even breath work, is there's a capability that's by logic people know that they can kind of get out of, right? Whereas with psychedelics, they've taken the mushroom, they've taken the medicine, they've done something, and immediately they're kind of, as you used earlier, the word captive towards that experience. Well,
Mhm.
what I kind of talk about within breathwork and hypnosis is you get this opportunity to kind of release in if you desire to surrender to it.
Yeah.
And there's always a get out of jail free card to say, hey, this is too much. And then I could help you kind of come out of the waters. Right.
Right. Yeah. It's really aligned to something that I talk about a lot with my breathwork clients in terms of like, especially like a lot of them that do have psychedelic experience, where I'm like, it's like a few degrees of separation, like just like you're saying, like the psychedelic, the medicine is going to help you over the cliff. That's the analogy I often give, is like
Yep.
walking up to the edge of the cliff and thinking about jumping off, and like what starts to happen in my body as I think about that. And like with mushrooms or ayahuasca or other medicine, it's like there's a big hand behind you just going, nope, here you go. Whereas with breath work, you have to be the one to
Hmm.
allow yourself to surrender and jump off. And it's I think it's a skill that's worth developing, because if you're relying on the psychedelic to like really help you into that expanded state, as opposed to really truly opening to, like you said, that inner intelligence that's there, it's waiting to kind of come online if you allow it to, and get that conscious thinking mind out of the way. What other areas in your life could that kind of be useful for?
It's
I,
perfectly
I
said.
don't know.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
it's an offer to consider, right? It's this idea, Jonathan, that we get permission, and that's what I like about hypnosis is it's a offer to consider. It's an
Hmm.
invitation of sorts. It doesn't have to be accepted, and I think just to kill a dead horse here is this idea that we don't have to accept every invitation that's given to us, and I think that's one of the biggest misunderstandings today with the psychedelic world is we do not have to accept every invitation that's been provided to us. We don't have to change jobs. We don't have to make sense of a living arrangement. We don't have to radically, accept the words of the higher sources that are powering down on us. We have to be very kind of conscious of doing something and leaving what's on the table that might not fit and taking what resonates with you.
Hmm. I love that. That reminds me of one of the notes that I wrote down in terms of the integration handbook. um, Two sections that I've really enjoyed are the maps of consciousness and channels of integration. And within both of those chapters, it goes into these different systems with which you could use to kind of navigate the waters of your life and your experiences. And it's so important, and it's something that I talk about a lot in terms of like thinking about who you're going to work with, like
Right,
who you decide to work with and their beliefs and their framework from which they're coming from can have huge impacts on the way that integrate and experience the things that you're going through, because they're going to be presenting things through a particular lens and a particular framework. So I really appreciate having all these different approaches, laid out for me in terms of like, hey, here's some different options, and here's how they work
right,
together. Here's how they contrast to each other. Find what resonates for you, and
right.
again, having that curiosity instead of,
Yep.
just kind of locking into a particular perspective.
Yeah, and in kind of my closing statements in the book and my closing often is this idea of making it your own. I'm not the gatekeeper, and what I love about our conversation today is knowing that we both do similar works with different gradients of variations. I say that to people, I go, you have to feel comfortable with the person. And you said
Yeah.
it beautifully. We're not for everybody. You need to massage the relationship. You have to trust the space and the container. And at some point in time, then you'll know if it resonates with you and if it resonates with the relationship of support. And that's, I say, about certain medicines, the person supporting you, the people that give you direction. Don't take everything so literally. Feel into it and make it your own. Really be conscious and intuitive and listen to your heart, listen to your thoughts, and walk with that.
Hmm. Beautifully said. Yeah, I love it. Well, I want to be cognizant of the time for both of us, and leave just a few minutes to talk about what are some of the projects that you have going on. How can people connect with you if they want to work with you?
Thank
Things of that
you.
nature.
I deeply appreciate that. Honestly, the best way to approach me and reach out to me would be through my website, healingsoulsllc.com. As you were so gracious to talk about my book, the Psychedelic Integration Handbook, is on Amazon, or I could send a personal copy. I'm very accessible. I appreciate any kind of insight or direction that they have. The projects I'm into right now is really, as I gently alluded to, is making sure people are conscious and aware of why they're doing it, right? This real harm reduction that we have as an undercurrent of this work, allowing people to know who they are and what they're doing. Another thing that I find deep value in is the integration of dreams. So I have these dream workshops I've been doing that are really fun. People from all over the country joining these DreamWorks, and then we use those as a backdrop of our integration exercises. It's been quite rewarding and liberating. Grateful
Wow,
to be here.
yeah,
Thank you.
that does sound like really interesting work. What what's one thing that somebody could do if they were interested in like getting more out of their dreams or starting that dream work to sort of start that?
The first thing I say to people is get out of our own way, right? So one of the things that happens, and it sounds like a loaded answer, but the idea is start to massage the space, give this liminal space, right? And the idea behind this liminal space is if you give yourself the container, you'd be alarmed at how much information will be downloaded within you. And going back, as you see the golden thread through our conversation, is as if we're too busy through our day, there's going to be no time to even opportunity or take the opportunity to listen to what happens throughout our evening. We'll be so consumed with pivoting to the daily tasks that we lose sight of the rich, fruitful information being downloaded on us.
Wow. Yeah, when I came off of sort of the daily cannabis use, wha- one of the ironies was that originally when I started working with cannabis or using it, I should say, it was to help me sleep. And eventually it got to a place where it was preventing me from sleeping, where I couldn't sleep without it. And one of
Right.
sort of the side effects of that was basically completely losing the ability to dream. And so when I stopped using it, the way that the dreams flooded back in was just such a wonderful gift. And so, yeah, dreams and dream material is definitely something that I'm always curious about learning more about.
Yeah, I don't think there's enough time to say the clarity of sobriety because that's ultimately a beautiful space and expression.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Ryan, this has been such a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate you being here. One last question, since the name of the podcast is The Vital Point, and my vital point is like, you have to, whatever the method, you've got to actually practice it. It's not enough just to read and then not actually apply it. So like, what's one vital point that you would share, like with somebody that you are working with, or that you'd want to share with a larger audience?
I'm so grateful you asked the question because I've been dying to say it, and I shared it loosely at the beginning. But it's being gentle with yourself. It's an action. It's not a passive experience. And so you talked about needing to take action in it. It's going, oh, and people will even hear this now. They'll go, yeah, sure, this new age hippie. Be gentle with yourself. No, what I'm saying is practice it in the morning. Find a way to be graceful and gentle. If that means giving yourself 5 more minutes to lay down or sip your coffee a little slower, give yourself the grace of your efforts and the gentleness within the expression of how you show up. And I think it's a wonderful, you've been alluding to Buddhism, and I deeply appreciate that as well, is this idea of what are you going to do to practice gentleness today? And the vital point for me is it's grace, it's compassion, and it turns right back into love.
Hmm. Thank you for offering that.
Thank you for giving me this platform. It's a deep honor.
Yeah, so definitely connect with Ryan if this interview kind of spoke to you. And I can't recommend the Psychedelic Integration Handbook enough. As Ryan mentioned, you can get it on Amazon or connect with him directly. It's a wonderful compendium into the world of integration. There's so much great information as well as practices that you can start to work with in your own process uh, for deepening your psychedelic experiences, or like we were saying, just enriching the experience of your life. A lot of beautiful self-development practices in here that you don't need any psychedelics to appreciate as well. So can't recommend that book enough, and definitely appreciate Ryan being here. Hope you can come back again. um, and yeah, pleasure is all mine. So
Always,
I really appreciate it.
always, always. The
Awesome.
invitation is always accepted.
Awesome. Well, yeah. So I hope you enjoyed this episode of The Vital Point. If you're watching on YouTube, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel. And if you're listening to the podcast on your favorite platform, would definitely appreciate a review. It helps us grow. And I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as I did with the conversation. And until next time, my friends, keep practicing because that's the vital point.